The dust from the stagecoach wheels had barely settled when Susannah Adams realized she was 6 hours late to her own wedding. The Montana Territory's sun was already sinking toward the horizon, painting the small frontier town of Whispering Pines in golden hues that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. But all Susannah could think about was the man waiting at the church, if he was even still waiting. April 1878 had been unseasonably warm across the plains, but Susannah shivered as the driver helped her down from the coach. Her pale blue traveling dress was wrinkled beyond salvation, her carefully pinned hair had come loose during the jarring final miles, and the small valise containing her wedding dress felt impossibly heavy in her trembling hand. "Sorry about the delay, miss," the driver said, handing down her trunk. "Them broken wagon axles ain't something we could have predicted." "I understand," Susannah replied quietly, though understanding did nothing to ease the tight knot of anxiety in her stomach. She'd traveled over 2,000 miles from Boston to marry a man she'd never met, and now she'd failed at the very first hurdle. The stagecoach depot was nearly deserted at this late hour. A young boy leaned against the hitching post, idly whittling a piece of wood. He looked up as Susannah gathered her courage and her belongings. "You the mail-order bride?" he asked, straightening up. Susannah's cheeks flushed. "Yes, I'm supposed to meet Mr. Ethan Jameson. I was expected hours ago." The boy nodded. "The whole town's been talking about nothing else for weeks. Mr. Jameson's still at the church." He pointed down the dusty main street. "Last building on the left before the creek." Hope fluttered in Susannah's chest. "He's still waiting?" "Yes, madam. Said he wouldn't leave till you arrived." The boy grinned, revealing a missing front tooth. Though Pastor Williams wasn't too happy about it. Susannah barely managed to thank the boy before hurrying down the street, the weight of her trunk slowing her steps despite her urgency. Whispering Pines was smaller than she had imagined. One main street lined with wooden buildings, a general store, a saloon, and a handful of other establishments whose purpose she couldn't immediately discern. Nothing like the bustling streets of Boston, but there was a certain charm to its simplicity. The white clapboard church came into view, its modest steeple reaching toward the darkening sky. Susannah paused, trying to catch her breath and compose herself. What kind of first impression would she make, arriving disheveled and exhausted? The letters they'd exchanged over the past 6 months had been formal but warm. Ethan Jameson had described himself as a cattle rancher with a promising spread outside of town. He'd written of his dreams for the future and his desire for a wife who would appreciate the beauty of Montana Territory, even with its hardships. Susannah had been forthright about her circumstances, a 24-year-old schoolteacher with no family left after the fever took her parents and younger sister. She'd written of her willingness to work hard and her hope for a home of her own. What she hadn't mentioned was her fear that she was making a terrible mistake by traveling across the country to marry a stranger. Now, standing before the church, that fear threatened to overwhelm her. But she'd come too far to turn back. Setting down her trunk, Susannah smoothed her travel-worn dress as best she could and walked toward the church doors. She hesitated before pushing them open. The hinges creaked in the quiet evening air, and Susannah stepped into the dimly lit interior. The church was empty save for a single figure sitting in the front pew, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the fading light from the windows. At the sound of the door, he turned, then stood. He was taller than she had expected, his frame filling the space between the pews as he walked toward her. In the dim light, she could make out a strong jawline shadowed with stubble, and eyes that seemed to assess her carefully. "Mr. Jameson?" Susannah's voice wavered. He stopped a few feet away. "Miss Adams?" "Yes." She twisted her gloved hands together. "I must apologize for my tardiness. The stagecoach encountered difficulties, and I—" A smile spread across his face, transforming his serious expression. "You're right on time for forever." The simple words, spoken in a deep voice tinged with relief, made something inside Susannah's chest loosen. She hadn't expected such poetry from the practical cattleman whose letters had been direct and unembellished. "I was afraid you'd given up on me," she admitted. "Never." He took a step closer. "I would have waited all night if necessary." Now that he was nearer, Susannah could see him clearly, a man of perhaps 30, with sun-bronzed skin and light brown hair that curled slightly where it met his collar. He wore a dark suit that seemed to constrain his rancher's frame and a freshly ironed shirt with a simple string tie. "I look a fright," she said, suddenly conscious of her appearance. "My wedding dress is creased beyond repair and I haven't had a proper wash in days." Ethan Jameson's smile softened. "You look beautiful, Miss Adams, but if you'd prefer to postpone the ceremony until tomorrow—" "No," Susannah surprised herself with her certainty. "I've kept you waiting long enough." "Then allow me to help you with your belongings. Pastor Williams is at his home next door. He said to fetch him if you arrived." There was a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes that touched Susannah deeply. He had doubted she would come. "I always keep my promises, Mr. Jameson." "Ethan," he corrected gently. "If we're to be married within the hour, perhaps we should use our given names." "Susannah," she offered in return, and was rewarded with another smile that reached his eyes. He moved past her to retrieve her trunk from outside, and Susannah took the moment alone to gather her thoughts. This man was to be her husband, to share her life, her bed, her future. The enormity of it should have terrified her, but instead, she felt strangely calm. When Ethan returned, he placed her trunk carefully at the back of the church. "Would you like a moment to change?" he asked. "There's a small anteroom where the pastor prepares for services." Susannah nodded gratefully. "Yes, please." He showed her to the room, a simple space with a desk, a chair, and a small mirror hanging on the wall. "I'll fetch Pastor Williams while you prepare," Ethan said, closing the door behind him. Alone, Susannah opened her valise with shaking hands. The white dress inside was simpler than what most Boston brides would wear, but it had cost her nearly 2 months' salary. She shook out the wrinkles as best she could, then quickly changed, leaving her travel-stained blue dress folded on the chair. The white cotton dress had a high collar trimmed with lace, long sleeves, and a modest bustle. It wasn't fashionable by Boston standards, but it was the finest garment Susannah had ever owned. She pinned her dark hair back neatly, tucking loose strands into place, and pinched her pale cheeks to bring some color to them. The mirror reflected a woman on the brink of a new life. Brown eyes wide with anticipation, lips pressed together to still their trembling. Susannah barely recognized herself. A gentle knock at the door startled her. "Miss Adams, are you ready?" It was Ethan's voice, patient and steady. "Yes," she called back, picking up the small bouquet of dried lavender she'd carried all the way from Massachusetts. It was faded now, but still fragrant. When she emerged, Susannah found Ethan waiting with an elderly man in clerical attire, Pastor Williams, she presumed, and a middle-aged woman with kind eyes. "This is Mrs. Porter," Ethan explained. "She's our witness, and she insisted on being here for you." "Every bride needs another woman present on her wedding day," Mrs. Porter said warmly, stepping forward to adjust Susannah's collar. "Even if it is nearly nightfall." Pastor Williams cleared his throat. "Shall we begin? I usually prefer daylight for weddings, but these are unusual circumstances." The church was bathed in the golden light of the setting sun as Susannah walked down the short aisle toward Ethan, who waited beside Pastor Williams at the altar. There was no music, no gathering of friends or family, just the solemn presence of the four of them in the quiet sanctuary. The ceremony was brief. Pastor Williams spoke of duty and companionship, of the sanctity of marriage and the responsibilities it entailed. When it came time for the vows, Susannah was surprised by the steadiness of her own voice as she promised to love and honor Ethan Jameson, Ethan's hands were warm and calloused as they held hers. His eyes never left her face as he made his own vows, his voice deep and certain in the hushed church. When he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, a band she hadn't expected him to have, the metal caught the last rays of sunlight streaming through the windows. By the authority vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife, Pastor Williams declared. Mr. Jameson, you may kiss your bride. Ethan hesitated, then leaned forward to place a gentle, almost tentative kiss on Susannah's lips. It was brief, but Susannah felt her heart quicken at the contact. Mrs. Jameson, Ethan said softly as he drew back, testing the sound of her new name. The name felt strange to her ears, but not unwelcome. Mr. Jameson, she replied, a small smile playing at her lips. They signed the marriage certificate by lamplight, as darkness had fully descended. Mrs. Porter hugged Susannah warmly, whispering, "Welcome to Whispering Pines, dear. If you need anything at all, I'm just down the street at the Mercantile." Pastor Williams shook Ethan's hand firmly. "Take care of her, son. A wife is a blessing from the Lord." "I know it," Ethan replied, his gaze finding Susannah across the room. Outside, the night air was cool and crisp. Stars had begun to appear in the vast Montana sky, more stars than Susannah had ever seen in Boston. Ethan loaded her trunk onto a wagon that waited nearby, then helped her up onto the seat. "It's about 5 miles to the ranch," he explained as he climbed up beside her. "I hope you're not too tired from your journey." "I'll manage," Susannah assured him, though in truth, exhaustion was beginning to set in. She had been traveling for nearly 2 weeks, with little rest and constant anxiety about what awaited her at the end. The wagon wheels creaked as they left the small town behind. Susannah could see little of the landscape in the darkness, just the vague outlines of hills against the star-studded sky. "I should tell you about the ranch," Ethan said after they had traveled in silence for a while. "It's not what you might be used to in Boston, but it's good land. 200 acres, mostly for cattle grazing. The house is small, but solid. I built it myself 3 years ago." "How long have you been in Montana Territory?" Susannah asked. 5 years now. Came west after the war with nothing but the clothes on my back and a desire to start fresh." "You fought in the war?" It wasn't something he'd mentioned in his letters. Ethan nodded, his profile solemn in the moonlight. "Union Army. Enlisted in '63. Fought until Appomattox. Saw things I wish I hadn't." Susannah understood his reticence then. Many men didn't speak of their experiences during those terrible years. "My father was too old to fight, but my cousin died at Gettysburg." They lapsed into silence again, but it was a companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts as the wagon rumbled over the uneven road. "There it is," Ethan said eventually, pointing ahead. "Home." Susannah strained her eyes in the darkness. Gradually, she made out the shape of a cabin nestled against a backdrop of trees. As they drew closer, she could see it was larger than she had anticipated, a proper house, rather than the crude shelter she had feared. A lamp burned in one window, casting a welcoming glow into the night. Mrs. Barrow Thompson from the next property over came by to light the lamps and leave some food, Ethan explained. "Folks around here look out for each other." He helped Susannah down from the wagon, his hands strong and sure at her waist. For a moment they stood facing each other in the yard, the reality of their situation settling over them. They were no longer strangers bound by letters and promises, but husband and wife, with all that entailed. "Welcome home, Susannah," Ethan said quietly. The house was simple but comfortable, with a main room that served as both kitchen and living area, and 2 doors leading off to what Susannah presumed were bedrooms. A fire burned low in the stone hearth, and a pot of something fragrant simmered on the iron stove. "Are you hungry?" Ethan asked, taking her cloak and hanging it on a peg by the door. Susannah realized she hadn't eaten since morning. Yes, quite hungry, actually. Mrs. Thompson's beef stew is renowned in these parts, Ethan said, moving to the stove. Sit, please. You must be exhausted. Susannah sank gratefully into a chair at the solid wooden table. She watched as Ethan moved around the kitchen with easy familiarity, ladling stew into bowls and cutting thick slices of bread. There was nothing awkward or hesitant in his movements. He was clearly a man accustomed to caring for himself. Have you lived alone all this time? She asked as he set a steaming bowl before her. Ethan sat across from her. Yes. Hired hands come during calving season and for the roundup, but otherwise, it's just been me. He hesitated. And now you. They ate in silence for a few moments, Susannah savoring the rich stew after days of stagecoach fare. Tomorrow I'll show you around the property, Ethan said. There's a creek that runs along the south boundary, good water all year round. The garden's small, but the soil's rich. Mrs. Thompson gave me some seedlings for vegetables, if you're interested in planting. I'd like that, Susannah said. I've never had a garden of my own, but I've always wanted to try. Something like relief crossed Ethan's face. Good. That's good. After they finished eating, Ethan showed her to their bedroom. It was simply furnished with a large bed, a chest of drawers, and a washstand. Clean linens covered the bed, and a colorful quilt was folded at its foot. Mrs. Thompson's work again, Ethan explained, noticing her looking at the quilt. A wedding gift. An awkward silence fell between them. Despite the legality of their marriage, they were still essentially strangers. I'll sleep in the other room tonight, Ethan said finally. Give you time to settle in. Gratitude and something like disappointment mingled in Susannah's chest. Thank you, she said softly. That's very considerate. Ethan brought in her trunk and placed it at the foot of the bed. There's water in the pitcher if you want to wash up. The outhouse is around back, about 20 paces from the kitchen door. Thank you, Ethan. He lingered in the doorway, as if wanting to say something more. Instead, he nodded. Good night, Susannah. Sleep well. Good night. When he had gone, Susannah sat on the edge of the bed, the events of the day catching up to her all at once. She was married. She was in Montana territory, thousands of miles from everything familiar, and tomorrow she would begin her new life as Mrs. Ethan Jameson. She washed her face and hands in the cool water, changed into her nightdress, and slipped beneath the covers. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her for a long time as she listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the Montana night, the distant howl of a coyote, the soft hooting of an owl, the creak of the house settling. Susannah woke to sunlight streaming through curtainless windows. For a moment she was disoriented, the unfamiliar room confusing her sleep-addled mind. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back: the late arrival, the hasty wedding, the quiet meal with her new husband. The smell of coffee drifted under the door, along with the sound of movement in the main room. Susannah rose quickly, washed her face, and dressed in a simple brown skirt and white shirtwaist. She pinned her hair into a neat bun at the nape of her neck, wanting to look presentable for her first full day as Ethan's wife. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Ethan at the stove, frying bacon in a cast-iron skillet. He looked up at her approach, a smile warming his features. Good morning. Did you sleep well? Yes, thank you, Susannah lied, not wanting to admit that anxiety had kept her awake for much of the night. Can I help with breakfast? It's almost ready, but you could pour the coffee if you like. He nodded toward a pot on the back of the stove. Susannah found 2 mugs on a shelf and filled them with the steaming brew. The domestic scene felt both strange and right, as if they were playing at being husband and wife while simultaneously falling naturally into the roles. Over breakfast, Ethan outlined his plans for the day. I need to check on a heifer that's due to calve any day now. After that, I thought I'd show you around the property, if you're feeling up to it. I'd like that, Susannah said. And I'd like to unpack my things and perhaps organize the kitchen, if you don't mind. It's your home now, Ethan reminded her. You can arrange things however you see fit. After breakfast, Ethan left to check on his cattle, and Susannah took the opportunity to explore the house more thoroughly. The second bedroom was sparsely furnished, with just a narrow bed and a small table. Ethan's clothes hung from pegs on the wall, and his few personal possessions were neatly arranged on the table: a Bible, a whittling knife, a daguerreotype of an older couple she assumed were his parents. The main room was functional rather than comfortable, with sturdy furniture built for durability rather than aesthetics. The kitchen area was well organized, though, with a good selection of cooking implements and a pantry well stocked with staples: flour, sugar, beans, and preserved fruits. Susannah began unpacking her trunk, hanging her dresses in the bedroom and arranging her few personal belongings: a small collection of books, a sewing kit, a porcelain figurine that had belonged to her mother. The task took less time than she had anticipated, and soon she found herself at loose ends, waiting for Ethan's return. She was standing in the doorway, looking out at the landscape that was to be her home, when Ethan appeared, leading his horse up from the barn. In the daylight, she could fully appreciate the beauty of the setting rolling hills covered in spring grass, a line of trees marking the creek he had mentioned, and in the distance, mountains rising blue against the sky. Ethan smiled when he saw her. Ready for that tour? They walked the property together, Ethan pointing out the boundaries: the barn where he kept his horses and the milk cow, the chicken coop that currently housed a dozen hens, the small vegetable garden that needed attention after the winter. The creek has good fishing, he told her as they stood on its banks. Trout, mostly. And there are wild berries in those thickets, come summer raspberries and huckleberries. It's beautiful here, Susannah said sincerely. The vastness of the landscape was intimidating, but there was a serenity to it that appealed to her after the crowded streets of Boston. Different from what you're used to, I imagine. Very different, but in a good way. She turned to face him. Thank you for bringing me here, Ethan. Something softened in his eyes. Thank you for coming, Susannah. I know it was a leap of faith. For both of us, she pointed out. They continued their tour, Ethan explaining the seasonal rhythm of ranch life: the spring calving, the summer haying, the fall roundup, the quiet of winter. Susannah listened attentively, trying to memorize everything, knowing how much she had to learn. As they returned to the house, Ethan asked, "Would you like to go into town tomorrow? Meet some of the neighbors properly? Mrs. Porter mentioned she'd like to introduce you around." "I'd like that," Susannah said. "Everyone I met yesterday was very kind. Folks here are good people. They look out for each other." He paused. "They're curious about you, of course. It's not every day a Boston schoolteacher moves to Whispering Pines. I'm afraid they'll be disappointed. I'm really quite ordinary." "I doubt that," Ethan said quietly. The day passed quickly, with Susannah exploring her new home and beginning to put her own touches on it, while Ethan tended to the ranch chores. They ate dinner together as the sun was setting, the conversation easier than it had been the night before. That night, as Susannah prepared for bed, there was a gentle knock at the bedroom door. Ethan stood there looking somewhat uncertain. "I thought you might like this," he said, holding out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "It's not much, but—" Susannah unwrapped it to find a handcrafted wooden box, small enough to fit in her palm, with a delicate flower carved into its lid. "It's beautiful," she breathed, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "I made it during the winter evenings. Thought you might use it for hairpins or such." "You made this?" Susannah looked at him with new appreciation. "It's exquisite, Ethan. Thank you." A faint flush colored his cheeks. "Good night, then." "Good night," she replied, watching as he retreated to the spare room once more. Alone, Susannah placed the small box on the chest of drawers, touched by the gesture. It suggested a thoughtfulness she hadn't expected, a consideration for her comfort that went beyond mere duty. Perhaps this arrangement would develop into something more than a practical partnership, given time. The next morning, they rode into town in the wagon, Susannah wearing her best day dress, a deep green that complemented her dark hair. Ethan had business at the mercantile and the blacksmith's, while Susannah was to meet Mrs. Porter and be introduced to the women of Whispering Pines. "I'll meet you at the mercantile at noon," Ethan said, as he helped her down from the wagon in front of Mrs. Porter's home. "Will that give you enough time?" "I'm sure it will," Susannah replied, smoothing her skirts nervously. Mrs. Porter welcomed her warmly, ushering her into a comfortable parlor where several women were already gathered. "Ladies, this is Mrs. Jameson, Ethan's new bride." The women greeted her with varying degrees of enthusiasm, but all seemed genuinely curious about the newcomer. There was Mrs. Williams, the pastor's wife, Mrs. Thompson, whose stew Susannah had enjoyed, Mrs. Bennett, whose husband owned the saloon, and Miss Clark, the town schoolteacher. "We're so pleased you've joined our community," Mrs. Williams said, pouring tea for everyone. "Ethan is well regarded here. He's a good man." "Yes, he seems to be," Susannah agreed, accepting a cup of tea. "How are you finding ranch life?" Mrs. Thompson asked. "Quite different from Boston, I imagine." "It's an adjustment," Susannah admitted, "but Ethan has been very patient in showing me everything." The conversation flowed easily, with the women sharing stories about life in Whispering Pines, offering advice on gardening in Montana's climate, and gently probing Susannah about her background and her journey west. "We have a small lending library at the church," Miss Clark informed her. "Nothing like what you'd find in Boston, of course, but we try to keep up with current literature. You're welcome to borrow books anytime." "Thank you," Susannah said gratefully. "I brought a few volumes with me, but I'm always eager to read more." By the time she met Ethan at the mercantile, Susannah felt she had made a good start at integrating into the community. The women had been welcoming, if a bit reserved, and she had been invited to the next meeting of the Ladies' Aid Society. "How is your morning?" Ethan asked as he loaded supplies into the wagon. "Very pleasant. Everyone was kind." She hesitated. "They seem to think very highly of you." A slight smile curved his lips. "They're good neighbors. I've tried to be the same." On the ride back to the ranch, Susannah gathered her courage to ask about something that had been on her mind. "Ethan, would it be possible for me to write to the school board? Miss Clark mentioned they're looking for a teacher for the outlying farms during the summer months, just 2 days a week, when the children can't make it to town." Ethan looked surprised. "You want to continue teaching?" "If it wouldn't interfere with my duties at the ranch. I miss it already, and it would give me a chance to contribute something of value." She didn't mention that it would also give her a small income of her own, a measure of independence she wasn't ready to relinquish entirely. Ethan was quiet for a moment, considering. "I don't see why not, if it's what you want. The nearest farm is the Hendersons, about 3 miles east. Their boy Sam's a bright kid. Could use some proper schooling." Relief washed over Susannah. "Thank you. I'll write to the board tomorrow." When they reached the ranch, Ethan surprised her by asking if she'd like to learn to ride. "A wagon's fine for town, but if you're going to be teaching at the outlying farms, you might want your own horse. It would give you more freedom, too." The prospect was both exciting and intimidating. "I've never ridden before," Susannah confessed. "In Boston, ladies take carriages." "We'll start slow," Ethan promised. "I have a gentle mare that would suit you." The next day, after the morning chores were completed, Ethan led a chestnut mare from the barn. "This is Daisy. She's steady as they come." Susannah approached the horse cautiously, reaching out to stroke her velvety nose. Daisy snuffled at her hand, then nudged her gently, seeking treats. "She likes you," Ethan said, sounding pleased. Here, I'll help you mount. With his hands at her waist, Ethan lifted Susannah into the saddle. The height was dizzying at first, and she clutched the saddle horn tightly. Relax, Ethan advised, adjusting the stirrups for her. Daisy can sense if you're nervous. Just breathe and sit tall. For the next hour, he led Daisy around the yard, teaching Susannah the basics of horsemanship, how to hold the reins, how to use her legs to guide the horse, how to move with the animal's gait rather than against it. By the end of the lesson, Susannah was breathless but exhilarated. "You're a natural," Ethan told her as he helped her dismount. His hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary, and their eyes met in a brief, charged moment before he stepped back. "Thank you for the lesson," Susannah said, her voice slightly unsteady. "I'd like to learn more, if you're willing to teach me." "Of course, we'll practice every day if you like." The days fell into a rhythm, mornings spent on ranch chores, afternoons devoted to riding lessons or exploring the surrounding countryside. Susannah wrote to the school board and received a favorable response. She would begin teaching at the outlying farms in June, when the spring planting was complete. She and Ethan continued to sleep in separate rooms, though their interactions grew increasingly comfortable. They talked during meals, sharing stories from their pasts and dreams for the future. Susannah learned that Ethan had been raised on a farm in Pennsylvania, that he had a younger brother who had died in the war, that he had come west seeking a fresh start after the conflict that had torn the nation apart. In turn, she told him about growing up in Boston, about her years teaching in a crowded city school, about the epidemic that had claimed her family. The sharing of these personal histories drew them closer, building a foundation of understanding and respect. May brought warm days and cool nights. The ranch burst into life, calves frolicking in the pastures, wildflowers dotting the hillsides, the garden beginning to flourish under Susannah's careful tending. She had taken to ranch life more readily than she had expected, finding satisfaction in the physical work and the direct connection to the land. One evening, as they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Ethan turned to her with an unusually serious expression. "I've been thinking," he began, then stopped, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Yes?" Susannah prompted when he remained silent. "Are you happy here, Susannah?" The question caught her off guard. "Yes, I believe I am. More than I expected to be, truthfully." Relief flickered across his face. "I'm glad. I've been worried that you might regret your decision." "I don't regret it," she assured him. "This life is very different from what I knew, but there's a honesty to it that I find appealing." Ethan nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's what drew me here too. The clarity of it. The direct relationship between effort and reward." They sat in companionable silence for a few moments, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "Susannah," Ethan said finally, his voice low, "I know our marriage began as a practical arrangement, but I want you to know that I've come to care for you. Deeply." Susannah's heart quickened. She had been aware of her growing feelings for Ethan, his kindness, his quiet strength, his consideration for her needs and wishes, but she hadn't been sure if he felt the same. "I care for you too," she admitted softly. Ethan reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I'd like us to be a real marriage, in every sense. But only when you're ready. I won't rush you." The warmth in his eyes made Susannah's breath catch. I think I'd like that too." That night, when Susannah retired to the bedroom, she left the door ajar in invitation. Ethan appeared in the doorway, hesitant despite their earlier conversation. "Are you sure?" he asked. In answer, Susannah held out her hand to him. He crossed the room and took it, drawing her gently to him. Their first real kiss was tentative, a question asked and answered in the meeting of lips. The second was more certain, a sealing of promises made. Later, as they lay together in the darkness, Susannah's head pillowed on Ethan's chest, she felt a sense of completion she hadn't known was missing. This was what marriage could be, not just a practical arrangement for mutual benefit, but a true partnership based on respect, affection, and growing love. "Thank you for waiting for me at the church that day," she whispered. Ethan's arms tightened around her. "I would have waited forever." June brought long days of sunshine and the start of Susannah's teaching duties. Twice a week, she rode Daisy to the outlying farms, where she taught children of various ages in makeshift classrooms, a cleared corner of a barn, a shaded spot beneath a large tree, the front porch of a homestead. The work was challenging but rewarding, and she returned to the ranch each evening tired but fulfilled. Ethan, true to his word, had adjusted the ranch schedule to accommodate her teaching days. He was unfailingly supportive, listening with interest to her stories about her students' progress, offering suggestions when she encountered difficulties, taking pride in her accomplishments. Their life together settled into a pleasant rhythm, the initial awkwardness between them giving way to genuine companionship and deepening affection. They worked side by side during the day and shared their thoughts and dreams in the evenings. At night, they found comfort and joy in each other's arms, their physical intimacy a natural extension of their emotional connection. In late June, a wildfire threatened the eastern boundary of the ranch. For 3 days, Ethan and the neighboring ranchers fought the flames, using wet blankets and hastily dug fire breaks to protect their homes and livestock. Susannah worked alongside them, her face blackened with soot, her arms aching from wielding a shovel, her heart pounding with fear for their home and land. When the danger finally passed, the exhausted firefighters gathered at the Jameson ranch for a meal Susannah had prepared. As she moved among them, serving food and coffee, she caught Ethan watching her, pride and something deeper shining in his eyes. Later, when they were alone, he pulled her into his arms. "You were magnificent," he murmured against her hair. "I've never seen such courage." "I was terrified," Susannah admitted. "The thought of losing our home." "Our home?" Ethan repeated, wonder in his voice. "It really is our home now, isn't it?" "Yes," Susannah said, realizing it was true. Somewhere in the weeks since her arrival, this place had ceased to be Ethan's ranch where she happened to live and had become their home, a place she would fight to protect. July brought scorching heat and the haying season. Ethan and his hired hands worked from dawn till dusk, cutting, raking, and stacking the grass that would feed their cattle through the winter. Susannah rose before the sun to prepare hearty meals for the workers, then spent her days preserving the bounty from her garden, canning beans and peas, drying herbs, pickling cucumbers. One evening, as they sat on the porch seeking relief from the heat of the house, Susannah broached a subject that had been on her mind. "Ethan, do you ever think about having children?" He turned to look at her, surprise and hope mingling in his expression. "Often. Do you?" "Yes." She placed a hand on her abdomen, a gesture both protective and anticipatory. "I think we may be having one sooner than we expected." Joy spread across Ethan's face. "You're sure?" "Not absolutely certain, but it's been 2 months since, well, you know." Ethan drew her into his arms, his embrace gentle as if she had suddenly become fragile. "A baby," he whispered. "Our baby." The prospect of parenthood added a new dimension to their relationship. Ethan became even more solicitous of Susannah's well-being, insisting she rest during the hottest part of the day, bringing her wild strawberries he found while checking the herd, crafting a rocking chair for the porch where she could sit and sew in the cool evening breeze. Susannah, for her part, began planning for the baby's arrival, setting aside fabric for blankets and gowns, discussing with Mrs. Thompson and Mrs. Porter the practicalities of childbirth on the frontier, reading medical texts borrowed from Dr. Miller in town. August brought the county fair, an event Ethan assured Susannah was not to be missed. They drove into town early in the morning, Susannah bringing jars of her preserves and a quilt she had pieced during the winter evenings to enter in the competitions. The fairground was set up in a meadow just outside of town, tents and stalls arranged in a rough circle, with a central area for livestock judging and races. The atmosphere was festive, with children running between exhibits, women comparing handicrafts, and men gathering to discuss cattle prices and politics. Susannah was welcomed warmly by the women she had come to know over the summer. Her preserves earned a second-place ribbon, and her quilt was much admired, though it didn't place in the competition. Next year, Mrs. Porter assured her, it takes time to learn the judges' preferences. The highlight of the day was the horse race, in which Ethan had entered his stallion Thunder. Susannah stood at the rail, her heart pounding as the horses lined up at the starting line. When the signal was given, they exploded forward in a thunder of hooves and a cloud of dust. Thunder ran like his namesake, powerful and swift, with Ethan low over his neck, urging him on. They crossed the finish line a half-length ahead of the nearest competitor, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Ethan's face, when he rode back to where Susannah waited, was alight with exhilaration. "Did you see?" he called, swinging down from the saddle. "Did you see him run?" "He was magnificent." Susannah laughed, caught up in his excitement. "You both were." Ethan swept her into an embrace, heedless of the dust that covered him. "The prize money will buy that cradle you've been eyeing at the mercantile." Susannah's eyes filled with tears at his thoughtfulness. "You remembered?" "Of course I did." He kissed her lightly, mindful of their public setting. "It's important to you, so it's important to me." That night, as they drove home under a canopy of stars, Susannah reflected on how much her life had changed in the few months since she had arrived in Whispering Pines. She had come as a stranger, a mail-order bride late to her own wedding, uncertain of her future. Now she was a wife, a teacher, a soon-to-be mother, firmly rooted in this community and this life. "What are you thinking?" Ethan asked, noticing her pensive mood. "About how fortunate I am," Susannah replied honestly. "When my stagecoach was delayed, I was certain it was a sign that coming here was a mistake. Now I see it was just the opposite." Ethan's hand found hers in the darkness. "We were meant to find each other, Susannah. I believe that, with all my heart." Autumn painted the landscape in shades of gold and crimson. The days grew shorter, the nights cooler. Susannah's condition became evident, her body changing to accommodate the new life growing within. She continued her teaching, though Ethan insisted on driving her to the outlying farms now, rather than letting her ride. The harvest kept them busy gathering the last of the garden produce before frost, helping with the roundup of cattle that would be sold at market, preserving food for the winter months. Ethan built shelves in the root cellar to hold Susannah's jars of fruits and vegetables, and a cradle for the nursery corner of their bedroom. As winter approached, Susannah found herself thinking often of her first day in Whispering Pines, of arriving late and disheveled, afraid she had ruined her chance at a new life. She remembered Ethan's words in the church, "You're right on time for forever." He had been right. Their timing had been perfect after all. The baby arrived in early February during a snowstorm that had isolated the ranch for 3 days. Mrs. Thompson, who had been staying with them in anticipation of the birth, served as midwife. Ethan paced the main room, alternating between stoking the fire to keep the house warm and pressing his ear to the bedroom door, his face etched with worry. After hours of labor, a lusty cry announced the arrival of their son. Mrs. Thompson cleaned and swaddled the infant, then placed him in Susannah's arms before allowing Ethan into the room. "You have a son," Susannah said softly as Ethan approached the bed, his steps hesitant, his eyes fixed on the tiny bundle in her arms. A son, he repeated, awe in his voice. He sat carefully beside her, reaching out a tentative finger to touch the baby's cheek. He's perfect. What shall we name him? Susannah asked, though they had discussed possibilities for months. William, after my brother, Ethan suggested. If you don't mind. William Ethan Jameson, Susannah agreed. A good, strong name? As Mrs. Thompson discreetly left the room, Ethan gathered his wife and son in a gentle embrace. Thank you, he whispered, for coming here, for taking a chance on me, for our son. Tears of happiness slipped down Susannah's cheeks. Thank you for waiting for me that day, for giving me a home, for loving me. Always, Ethan promised, sealing the vow with a kiss. Spring returned to Montana territory, bringing with it the cycle of renewal, calves in the pastures, green shoots in the garden, wildflowers on the hillsides. William grew quickly. A robust baby with his father's eyes and his mother's dark hair, the center of his parents' world. On the anniversary of Susannah's arrival, Ethan surprised her with a picnic by the creek. Baby William nestled between them on the blanket. The water gurgled over stones, cottonwood trees rustled in the gentle breeze, and the scent of wild roses filled the air. Happy anniversary, Ethan said, presenting her with a small package. Inside, Susannah found a gold locket. When she opened it, she discovered a tiny portrait of the three of them, a miniature painted by an artist who had passed through Whispering Pines the previous month. It's beautiful, she breathed, tracing the delicate image with her fingertip. So we'll always be together even when we're apart, Ethan explained as he fastened the chain around her neck. Susannah leaned against him, their son sleeping peacefully in her lap. I never imagined I could be this happy, she confessed. When I left Boston, I hoped for security, for a home. I never dreamed I would find love as well. I hoped for a partner, someone to share the work and the dream of building something worthwhile, Ethan replied. I found so much more in you, Susannah. They sat in contented silence, watching the play of light on water, the dance of leaves in the breeze, the peaceful face of their sleeping child. The journey that had brought them together, a journey of loss and hope, of courage and trust, had led to this moment of perfect happiness. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the land that was their home, Ethan helped Susannah to her feet, cradling their son in one arm while the other encircled her waist. Let's go home, he said simply. Hand in hand, they walked back toward the ranch house, toward the life they had built together. Behind them, the creek continued its eternal journey. The wild roses nodded in the evening breeze, and the vast Montana sky embraced them all in its infinite blue. In the years that followed, the Jameson Ranch prospered. 2 more children joined their family, a daughter, Emily, born on a clear autumn day, and another son, Daniel, who arrived during a spring thunderstorm. The house expanded to accommodate the growing family, with Ethan adding rooms and a larger kitchen as their needs changed. Susannah continued teaching, eventually establishing a proper school at the crossroads where children from several ranches could attend. She became known throughout the county for her dedication to education and her innovative teaching methods. Ethan's cattle operation grew, with the Jameson brand becoming synonymous with quality throughout the territory. He served on the town council, advocating for improvements that would benefit the entire community, a new bridge over the creek, a proper doctor's office, a larger school building in town. Together, they weathered the challenges that frontier life presented: droughts that threatened their cattle, harsh winters that tested their endurance, illnesses that brought fear and sleepless nights. Through it all, their partnership remained strong, their love deepening with each passing year. On summer evenings, they would often sit on the porch as the sun set, watching their children play in the yard, marveling at how much their lives had changed since that April day when Susannah had arrived late to her own wedding. The delay that had seemed so disastrous at the time had become a family joke, a reminder that the best things in life often happen when least expected. "You're right on time for forever," Ethan would say, echoing his words from that first meeting, and Susannah would smile, knowing that forever had turned out to be even better than she had dared to dream.